Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. We all know people who like to live in a world of fantasy. Maybe they read a lot or they spend a lot of time watching movies, and many of us know people who are so in love with the world of fantasy that they actually dress up and pretend to be their favorite characters, superheroes and magicians, in order to fully immerse themselves in that world of fantasy. We true crime people also know that for serial killers, fantasy is very important. Serial killers spend hours upon hours thinking about their next kill, planning for it, stalking their victims, selecting their victims. Details are very important for serial killers because they have a fantasy in their head that they want to bring into real life. Today we are talking about a serial killer who blended his fantasy with his reality in more ways than one, and his dark fantasies ended up becoming nightmares for those unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. This is the case of the serial killer sometimes called the Canal Killer, the Zombie Hunter, Bryan Patrick Miller. Let's get into it. May 26, 1992. Brandy Lynn Myers, who is in the 6th grade at Sunny Slope Elementary in Phoenix, Arizona, goes missing. She and her family lived in an apartment in a modest area of Phoenix at the time. Brandy had a large group of friends in the neighborhood, and the group could often be seen playing outdoors and around the neighborhood. She was a sweet girl who was eager to please and who everyone loved. Brandy and her sister Kristen decided to try and get pledges for their school's readathon fundraiser, so they started going door to door, asking neighbors to contribute to their cause. It's kind of unbelievable to imagine that we used to send our kids door to door alone to strangers' houses to ask for donations, but we did. My kids did that not that long ago, and I think there's still a couple of programs here in my town where kids go selling things, and it's not a good idea. Unfortunately, it took us some time and some missing kids to realize this is not a good idea. At the last minute, Brandy's sister Kristen decided she did not want to go with Brandy, and so Brandy went off alone. Kristen watched from their apartment balcony as Brandy turned the corner and disappeared. They never saw her again. Brandy's mother called the police as soon as she got home from work and found out that Brandy had been gone for hours. Search efforts began immediately. This was not a neighborhood known for this type of crime, and everyone was very concerned. Police helicopters and search dogs were brought in to search the neighborhood and the surrounding Phoenix desert, but Brandy was nowhere to be found. May 28, 1992. Some people out walking came upon a pile of trash that looked a little out of place to them. As they got closer, they saw it. It was the body of a female. The police were called, and at first they believed the body was that of Brandy Lynn Myers, who had been missing for 2 days at that point, but they quickly realized this was not Brandy. Identification efforts were made by the police for some time, and they were surprised when they could not find out who this person was. She was young, she was relatively healthy, and she was wearing this outfit, jeans, and a pink flowered top with a black bow in her hair, and thick glasses were laying near her body. The poor girl had been strangled, but no one came forward to report a missing girl. And finally, she was buried as a Jane Doe in the Twin Buttes Cemetery in Tempe, Arizona. That's such a sad story. Someone who isn't even missed, someone who isn't reported missing, and especially for someone so young, that's pretty disturbing. Unfortunately, almost 2 decades later, it is discovered that this victim's life story was even sadder than her death. The Phoenix police now have 2 very serious crimes on their hands in just 2 days. They cannot find Brandy Lynn Myers, and they have a second murdered person that they cannot even identify. They were really dealing with a contrasting situation. They had one girl whose family loved her, so the police are doing everything they can to find her, and then one girl has seemingly no one looking for her. That's where we really rely on the police, isn't it? They're there to be the advocate for the victims that nobody else cares about. Authorities only knew about the second death because her body was found, not because anybody cared where this girl was. Parents in the area got a lot more strict about where their kids were playing and how far they wandered and when they came home. But eventually, life did get back to normal, and all but Brandy's family and the police mostly forgot about what had happened for a while. But then it happened again. November 8th, 1992. Angela Brasso, a 22-year-old college student, left her home to go for a bike ride on a path that runs next to the Arizona canals near Cactus Road. Hours after she left, and long after she should have been home from her bike ride, her boyfriend called the police and reported her missing. The next day, Angela's mutilated and decapitated body was found on the bike path she had been riding on. 11 days later, her head was found floating in the Arizona Canal. This horrific murder and the condition of Angela Brasso when she was found terrified the citizens of Phoenix. Gun sales went up and people stopped allowing their children to go anywhere without them. They now had a disappearance and 2 murders in the same area in the same year, and this was not normal or usual for anyone living there. Everyone that had kind of eased up after Brandy went missing and then the unidentified girl was found, well, they were now more on edge than ever. People who were kids at the time now remember their parents warning them not to talk to anyone they didn't know, not to venture outside their yards to play. People were scared. They were nervous. They had a madman running around Phoenix taking and killing young females. And little did they know he wasn't finished yet. September 23rd, 1993. 17-year-old Melanie Burness decides to go for a bike ride. In a near repeat of the story I just told you about Angela, she goes missing as well. Again, the next day, similar to the story in Angela's case, her body is found near the Black Canyon Freeway and Thunderbird Road near the very same canal that Angela and the unidentified female had been found murdered. Like Angela Brasso, Melanie had been stabbed. Other things were done to her, and she had been dumped near the canal.
Even after sunset, the bikers and joggers keep rolling along, some of them unaware that the body of a murdered teen was found here. Many who travel this path, though, come prepared.
Sometimes I do end up riding this path at night. I ride with my mace and usually a chain in my hand because I don't really trust anybody out here, no matter what time of the day or night.
Although this bike path near Metro Center is well traveled, after about 7 o'clock, it's no place to be. Just to give you an idea, it is total darkness out here.
Well, I don't worry during the day. Obviously at night, sure, there's a concern, but we always ride during the day, and I've been down here at night, and there's nothing on this place at night.
Many who use this bike path remember another murder in this area a year ago. 22-year-old Angela Brasso went on a bike ride and was murdered. Her killer never found. It's causing some uneasiness.
It's kind of strange in the same place. What did they do with the case on Angela? I mean, what happened there? And now this has happened again in the same area.
At this point, it is pretty much undeniable. Phoenix has a serial killer. But they've got a serial killer who has left his DNA on some of these victims. And even back in 1993, that was important. But sadly, it was not enough. Months go by and then years go by, and all 4 of these murders of Brandy, the unidentified victim, Angela, and Melanie go cold. But the DNA is in the system, and thankfully, some DNA detectives decide they are going to make these cases their priority. I love this stuff. I find it fascinating, and I get really excited when I hear about people, ordinary citizens, taking up causes like these. I think it's a really beautiful way to donate your time and your talent. And believe me, we are going to hear more and more stories like this in the future, and that's a great thing. You guys know part of the reason I started this channel is because I want to be able to raise money to donate to departments that have cold case DNA cases. They can't test the DNA because there's no money to do it. Now, don't get me started on why there's no money to do something that important when there seems to be money for other things. But the bottom line is, I really want to be able to help with that. If we've got DNA on unsolved cases, that DNA should be tested. I feel strongly about that. March of 2011. Cold case detectives decide that with new technology, it's time to try and identify the unidentified female buried in 1993 as a Jane Doe. Her body is exhumed and tests are run. They do, in fact, identify this victim. And like I said earlier, her story about her life is just as sad, if not sadder, than her death. The girl was Shannon Amok, and her life had been a horror show. She was born to a 16-year-old girl who gave her to CPS when she was 3 years old. Shannon then went from foster home to foster home, and no one cared about her at all. She had absolutely no one. She was treated like a throwaway. Shannon was labeled as incorrigible, and after running away more than 40 different times, CPS petitioned the courts to release her as their charge, stating they couldn't control her and they didn't want to be responsible for her any longer. That makes me really angry, and I certainly hope things have changed in that system since then. This was obviously a girl who needed more supervision and more attention and more love, but instead she was tossed aside. The judge in this case granted the CPS request, and Shannon was just left alone in the world with absolutely no one to fend for herself. I mean, 16 years old, someone who has nobody, and we can't count on CPS to take care of this person? That's troubling. The last time anyone had seen Shannon was 8 weeks before her murder. She was treated like trash in life, and she was treated like trash in death, and I find this story very sad. Shannon was once, oh, this is so sad. Shannon was once working with a counselor who was trying to put some fear into her. And he asked her, "What do you want on your gravestone? Because if you keep this up, someone is going to kill you." And Shannon replied, "I want a blank headstone. No one cares about me while I'm alive, so why should anyone care about me when I'm dead?" That poor girl. Some people have it really hard. After Shannon was exhumed and identified, she was reburied, and this time a fitting tombstone with her name and this quote was donated for her grave. They had finally identified the last canal victim, but more years would pass as they searched for the killer. 2014. A genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick was involved with an organization that worked with police on cold cases. She attended an event and met some Phoenix cold case detectives in 2014, and they began discussing these canal murders. Colleen was actually one of the presenters at the event, and the Phoenix police saw the potential Colleen's methods had for helping them to solve these cold cases. A few weeks after the event, the police sent Colleen the DNA profile taken from their crime scene, and she went to work. Using what is called the Y profile, Colleen began matching relatives in several genealogical databases, and soon she found out that the last name of their perpetrator was Miller. She had narrowed down the possible source of the crime scene DNA from 2,000 individuals to only 5. It's incredible. Distant cousins of the perpetrator had uploaded their DNA into some of these databases, and this allowed Colleen to find the match. She contacted the police, and a suspect came into view. He was not a suspect that the police were unaware of. In fact, this suspect was known to be a violent offender. This is Bryan Patrick Miller. He was in and out of juvenile detention, and in 1989, when he was just 16 years old, he ran up to a woman who was simply walking near Paradise Valley Mall and stabbed her in the back. Bryan was charged with aggravated assault, and the prosecution moved to try him as an adult, but they later abandoned that request in exchange for Bryan pleading guilty to attempted second-degree murder. Bryan took the plea, he admitted his guilt, and he was sent to juvenile detention for a year until he turned 18. Prepare for the broken record that is me talking about this. Where was the aftercare program? Where was the follow-up? Where was the social protection program that comes in and monitors this known violent criminal, a 16-year-old who is stabbing people? Nowhere to be seen, my friends, nowhere to be seen. These programs don't exist. He was released and turned back out onto the street, and, well, let's talk a little bit about Bryan Patrick Miller. He's an interesting guy. He's pretty dorky, kind of a weirdo. I love me a lovable weirdo. They're the best. Bryan Miller is not a lovable weirdo. He's a dangerous weirdo. The kind of dangerous weirdo that hides in plain sight, that acts weird in plain sight. Bryan Miller was well known in the Phoenix Valley capes and cowls cosplay scene, which is like superheroes and magicians and wizards. Bryan Miller's persona in the cosplay scene was that of a mutant-slaying, blood-covered zombie hunter. He had invested some serious time and serious money into his costumes. He was actually kind of locally famous for this character. Look at these photos of him with the area cops. He's posing with them, smiling, like the real-life psychopath that he is. He's just hiding right in plain sight, brazenly approaching police and asking them for a photo with him. Bryan Miller even had a car painted to look like a police car, which is something I find incredibly odd. I think this is sketchy and honestly really quite disturbing. This looks just like a police car, with the exception of the fake blood that he put on it from time to time and the letters on the back that say Zombie Hunter. But think of like if someone had dementia or autism. Think about a child. They might not realize this isn't a real police car, and that could create a serious problem. I don't know, maybe I'm being overly sensitive about this, but I don't really like the fact that he was allowed to mock up a car to look like a police car. Apparently it was a decommissioned police car for cosplay. I think that's dangerous for anyone. I think the fact that he turned out to be who he turned out to be shows just how dangerous it can be to do anything that impersonates a police officer. And as those of us who love true crime are painfully aware, many killers have a fascination with the police, and they love to impersonate police officers. So yeah, I have a problem with this. In 2011, Bryan Miller joined the Arizona Steampunk Society and quickly became one of its most avid members. He was obsessed, immersed in cosplay. It was his whole life. A lot of people participate in cosplay. You know, they do it a few times a year. For Bryan Miller, it was every single weekend. Even when there weren't any events taking place, he could be seen driving around Phoenix in his zombie hunter car, dressed to the nines in his cosplay attire, his zombie hunter persona. Isn't this interesting? John Wayne Gacy chose to become a clown. He said clowns could get away with murder. He liked the makeup and the costume and the second persona of being a clown. The Zodiac Killer wore his famous executioner-style hood. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana wore that, kind of burlap sack mask over his head. And then, there's James Holmes, the movie theater killer who dressed up as the Joker. I find these correlations interesting. I find them worth mentioning because I think it says a lot about a certain type of psychology. People who like to think of themselves as more than one person, or people who want to hide behind a second persona. Maybe they feel like when they're that second personality, they can do things that they can't do when they're themselves. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing in itself, but for some people it is. A friend of Bryan Miller's said of him, "The cool thing about cosplay is people really get impassioned about it. If you can imagine a dystopia where zombies were out there, what would you be doing in this world?" Well, Bryan Miller was showing what his place would be in that world. Meaning Bryan was showing you that he would be the big bad zombie hunter in a world where zombies existed. He fancied himself a warrior, a brave soldier who would take out the threat in this alternative world. Or did he simply like the thought of being able to kill over and over? Another friend said he feels like Bryan was so invested in cosplay because it was a way to escape his problems and his real life that wasn't very interesting. Bryan Miller was a single man. He was divorced, but he does have a child. He had previously tried to kind of reinvent himself in the world of religion at the Paradise Valley Mennonite Church. Something happened in his life and he abruptly stopped attending that church, but it was through friends he met at that church that he found the home he was renting. And church members would come by every Sunday and pick up his daughter, so there was still some kind of involvement there. Now, when Bryan was involved in the church, he was married, and church members remember Bryan and his wife at the time as distant and odd, nerdy. Some people use the word awkward, which, kind of comes as no surprise. People report that they feel Bryan, who was nerdy and awkward in real life, felt like a superstar in the cosplay world, and that's where he felt most at home. I found this little story about Bryan Miller that I think is interesting. Bryan had a friend who is an artist named Keen Azaria. Keene always dreamed of becoming a sketch artist for the police, and so in his free time, he would make these parody wanted posters, kind of jokes, for his friends in the cosplay world, and he would post them on social media and everybody would get a kick out of them. Well, one time, Keene made this poster here about Bryan Miller. He drew a caricature of Bryan and added to the poster, "Wanted for impersonating a leprechaun," and he kind of gives a general description of what Bryan looks like. Kind of looks like Dwight Schrute. Keene later reported that everybody was laughing about the poster, commenting on it on social media, but he never heard a word from Bryan, which was weird. He said, "Bryan always liked my work and he always commented on my posts. I thought maybe I made the caricature too unflattering and that he was mad about it, but it was definitely weird that he never said a word about it." Maybe it was because it was a wanted poster and Bryan knew what he had done and it was just a little too close to home, you know? Keene also told another story about how Bryan was once in his home. Keene said, "I had a 3-foot replica of the Zodiac Killer's 340 cipher on the wall in my house. Bryan asked, 'What is that?' and I told him what it was, but there was no further discussion." So Keene found that odd later on, and I find it odd, that an actual serial killer wasn't interested in talking about serial killers. But with Bryan Miller, who knows? This guy was an odd duck. Police have quietly started to investigate the zombie hunter, Bryan Miller's life, and they are feeling pretty confident that they are onto something, but now they have to prove it. Now they have to show, with as much evidence as they can gather, that Bryan Miller is their serial killer. They want that conviction. They set up a sting. An undercover police officer contacts Bryan Miller, posing as a security company representative who is trying to enlist Bryan's help. This undercover officer tells Bryan that his security company, that doesn't exist, has been hired to conduct surveillance at a business that is next to Bryan's place of employment. He tells them, "We need somebody close to the location to keep an eye on the business that is under surveillance. We need you to work with us and kind of report back to us." The undercover cop also told Bryan that his company, the fake company, went through Bryan's employer's records and chose Bryan because they thought he was the best candidate to help the police. So they were kind of buttering him up, stroking his ego as they went along. The undercover cop sets up a meeting with Bryan Miller at a Phoenix restaurant. It's a Chili's to be precise, and the two sit and have coffee together. When the meeting is over, Bryan gets up and leaves the table, and the undercover officer pulls out an evidence bag and collects Bryan's coffee mug that is covered in his DNA. The coffee cup is taken to the police laboratory, and Bryan's saliva from the mug is tested. It is an exact match to the DNA found on Angela Brazo and Melanie Burness. They've got him. Bryan Miller, the zombie hunter, is the Phoenix serial killer. January 13th, 2015. Police descend on Bryan Miller's home. What they find is pretty shocking. Bryan is a hoarder. The house is an absolute disaster scene. There is garbage stacked to the ceiling. There are boxes and cans and bottles, and it is absolutely filthy. The house is such a mess that Phoenix police tell reporters they expect to be on the scene for several days because it's going to take them that long just to go through the garbage. Bryan's wife had left him some years before this, but his daughter did stay with him from time to time, and I think it's really sad that a child was subjected to living like this. I know that it happens, but I really feel for her. I'm sure all of this has been incredibly hard. 42-year-old Bryan Patrick Miller is arrested and taken into custody on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He is charged with killing Angela Brazo and Melanie Burness.
Tonight, after more than 20 years, a Phoenix man is behind bars accused of both murders. This is 42-year-old Bryan Patrick Miller as he made his initial appearance in court today. Tricia Hendricks joins us live from the suspect's home in North Phoenix, where police made that arrest after searching his property last night. Tricia?
Mark Linsu, finding the person who murdered those 2 young women was one of the top priorities for Phoenix police more than 2 decades ago. Now it's once again keeping detectives busy, all because of DNA evidence. The arrest may offer some closure for the family members of 2 young women, both victims of brutal murders more than 20 years ago. Their bodies found in the Arizona Canal less than a year apart.
Bodies found murdered and mutilated in both of these different cases, and so certainly one that got a lot of attention.
Phoenix police arrested 42-year-old Bryan Patrick Miller on Tuesday. Today, his home is the focal point of a cold case investigation. Detectives are searching for evidence while Miller sits behind bars. Neighbors reacting to the news of his arrest.
I'm glad because those families need closure, and it's scary to know because you really don't know your neighbors.
Some knew Miller as Zombie Hunter because of what appeared to be an old police car he had with those words on the back.
This year for Halloween, he put bloody handprints all over the car. And it says Zombie Hunter on the side. So I don't know if maybe the guy had like a gore fetish or a death fetish.
One of the key components of this case rests on DNA evidence, which police didn't have when the crimes were committed.
This individual has engaged in this type of pattern of behavior previous to this offense. You don't start with a murder and end with a murder.
Detectives working on the case pulled Miller's name out of the information provided to police by a tip they received back in 1994, along with hundreds of other names. When they looked at his pre-criminal behavior, they found a stabbing that occurred when he was 15 years old near PV Mall.
Undercover detectives in a ruse were able to obtain his DNA just this week. Our crime lab last night compared it to the DNA collected at the scene of these two homicides in 1992, and it was a positive match.
The news of Bryan's arrest spreads through the cosplay community like wildfire. The message boards and Reddit threads are inundated with comments. People discussing the fact that they knew Bryan from the cosplay scene and that they cannot believe he is being accused of being a serial killer. Other people, well, they are not so shocked. Bryan Miller's ex-wife, Amy, comes forward with some very disturbing information. She claims that Bryan is a sadist and that their intimate life had become so scary and so violent that she felt she had to get out of the marriage. Bryan's ex-wife told the media that one time Bryan said to her, "I really want to kill you, but I don't because I love you too much." Yeah, that's terrifying. Amy was then questioned by the police, and she tells them that years ago, Bryan told her a young girl had come to his door trying to sell something and that he had killed her and dumped her body in the trash. Amy claims that she didn't know what to make of the story, that she didn't know if Bryan was lying or making it up. I mean, okay, definitely probably call the police if somebody tells you something like that. However, Brandy's body has never been found, and there is no way to link Bryan Miller to her disappearance or her death, at least not right now. But most people involved in this case strongly believe that Bryan abducted and murdered Brandy Myers. Many also believe that he killed Shannon Amok as well, but there is not enough evidence at this time to charge him. Everyone involved hopes that at some point there will be evidence and they will be able to charge Bryan in those two murders. After Bryan is arrested, the press finds out about his previous criminal record. He was arrested back in 2002 for stabbing a woman in Washington state. Her name was Melissa Ruiz Ramirez, and she was stabbed in the back, just like the woman walking near Paradise Valley Mall in Phoenix in 1989. Bryan kind of came out of nowhere and attacked Melissa for no reason, just as he had done to the victim in 1989. Bryan was charged in this stabbing, but he was acquitted and set free. So when this information comes to light, it opens up a new avenue of investigation. Bryan has lived not only in Washington state, but in Hawaii. So now cold case detectives in those areas are looking into the possibility that Bryan could be the killer in unsolved cases from those regions. Phoenix Police Sergeant Trent Crump said it would be very unusual if Angela Brazo was Bryan's first victim and Melanie Bernas was his last. They don't think that's the case at all. They are pretty convinced that Bryan has many more victims. Sergeant Crump, who has investigated Bryan extensively, believes that Bryan stabbed the women when he was younger because both of them somewhat resemble his mother, and Bryan has a hatred for his mother. Again, this is something we see all the time in not only violent criminals, but specifically criminals who become serial killers. As Bryan Patrick Miller sits in jail, his life is dissected by police and the media and the public alike. But Bryan Miller isn't planning to go down without a fight. Bryan engages in a series of legal tactics designed to delay his trial. He sits in jail for 4 years. firing attorneys and hiring new ones, filing paperwork to cause delays, all the usual and normal things these guys do. There was actually a trial date set for October of 2019, but then more delays prevented that from happening. And then again, I'm like a broken record with this, the pandemic hits and everything is halted. During this time, everything slows to a crawl. Bryan Miller and his attorneys file a motion to have the DNA evidence collected from the coffee cup in the restaurant thrown out. Their position is that the DNA was obtained without a warrant and without Bryan's cooperation. But in January of 2022, a judge rules that that evidence was obtained legally and states in his ruling, customers who walk to a restaurant's exit having left such items behind implicitly communicate their intent to abandon those items. And as we know, things like garbage, things that have been abandoned, are fair game when it comes to collection for DNA testing. Well, when this doesn't work, Bryan Miller and his attorneys claim that Bryan is mentally incompetent to stand trial. This was back in August of 2021. So this claim and the mandatory evaluations that follow take up more time. Just a few months ago, in January of 2022, a judge found that Bryan Miller is mentally fit to stand trial. 2 mental health experts examined Bryan Miller and both agreed he is faking whatever symptoms he thought were going to prove him insane, and that he is in fact perfectly fit to stand trial and be held accountable for his crimes. The other thing the judge brought up during his ruling is the fact that Bryan Miller had been in jail for 6 years and had never once claimed he was mentally unfit. So this was just another obvious tactic to delay the inevitable. As of right now, Bryan Miller has not been to trial. I couldn't find any information confirming that a trial date has been set at this time, but that should be happening in the very near future. And when it does, you can be sure I will bring you an update on this case. Now, there are other suspected victims of Bryan Miller. On June 15, 2013, 19-year-old Adrienne Salinas was walking to a local gas station to hail a cab after a night of partying with her friends. Somewhere between her apartment and the gas station, she vanished. Weeks later, on August 6th, her body was found in a wash in Apache Junction near the Superstition Mountains. After everyone found out about Bryan, what he is, friends of his came forward and told the police that the weekend Adrienne disappeared, they had been with Bryan less than a mile from her apartment. Bryan Miller had been in the exact area on the night she vanished, so they're looking into this as another possible victim, another possible murder committed by Bryan Miller. This is a case that is far from concluded. We still have a ways to go before we will know what becomes of the Phoenix Canal Killer, the zombie hunter, Bryan Patrick Miller. But there's no question, the streets of Phoenix are a much safer place with him behind bars. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Like the video if you liked the video, and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to support me. It helps a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.